Hello, hello. Welcome to episode 23 of the Golden Question podcast. In today's episode, I'm going to be answering the question, how has Donald Trump failed us? And now the us is referring to Trump supporters, but it could refer to America as a whole, even for those who haven't voted for Donald Trump and still hope that he would be a good president. And unfortunately, he has failed us. He hasn't lived up to his promises. And I'd like to make mention of one critical point in Trump's campaign that has honestly sold it for me, and what has earned him my pledge and my vote. And that is in the first presidential debate against Hillary Clinton. And he said on the topic of economics, he said, and I quote, "We are in a big, fat, ugly bubble." And then he went on to say things are going to get awfully bad if the Fed, raises interest rates and everything comes crashing down. And he made mention to the stock market and how the stock market again was inflated, and if the Fed raised interest rates, the stock market would come crashing down. And I highly recommend for people to watch it because it was a very um, awe dropping moment or jaw dropping moment, but it was a very awestruck moment for many people, and I've seen other people's reaction to it, a lot of economists' reaction to it, because it's like you don't hear that from a politician. You don't ever hear a politician say we are in a bubble, right? This economy is just one big bubble that's being inflated, and you rarely hear politicians mention the Fed and mention the Fed in a bad light. And what happened right after, or actually right before this, Hillary just gave your typical politician, big government speech. We need to make sure that the economy works for everybody, not just for the rich, and by implementing the policies that they prescribed, it'll make the economy better and more for everybody and more fair, whatever. It's nothing new. And he said, typical politician, all talk, all prom. Again, I don't remember the exact words, but he said, all promise, typical politician, all talk, no action. Sounds good, doesn't work. And then he goes, this country is suffering because of the failed policies of politicians, right? Who pass these policies and lawmakers, and even I would argue the courts who are required to judge these policies and see if they are in accordance with the Constitution, and letting laws that are blatantly obvious that they're unconstitutional, and nonetheless letting them pass. But that right there, that I don't know how long that was, maybe like 3 minutes or so. Right there was the most critical point out of anything Donald Trump has said. I mean, before he just sounded like as if you just picked, a random Republican off the street and asked them to share some of your policies. And obviously, people, not the most educated, but sort of just generalizes about certain things and doesn't get into specific details. But when he said that, I said, you know what? I think I might vote for this guy. Obviously, at the time, I couldn't vote. I was, yeah, it was, how old was I? It was turning 16 um next year. So yeah, I was 15, or yeah, I had just turned 15. So I couldn't vote for him, but obviously if I did at the time I would have. And obviously I did tell my parents to vote for him. But what that segment right there showed me is that he knew the problems in this country. He knew that the numbers that the government has touted for saying the economy has recovered, everything's going back to normal. Obama has succeeded in lifting us out of this recession. All of that was nonsense because obviously these numbers, first of all, are very manipulated in a way to obviously make it seem as if we've recovered. And one number in particular is the CPI, the inflation number, and how that obviously was downcasted to show that inflation wasn't a problem, and the Fed has succeeded in its policies and its attempt to inflate this economy. And one could even go back even before the crash and show you that the Fed from the early 90s was inflating a bubble, or should I say the late 90s was inflating a bubble that ultimately caused the not only the collapse in the tech bubble in the late 90s, but also the housing bubble. So it's the Fed just inflating one bubble after the next, and after every failed attempt and reinflating the next one, it it warps the CPI and tells you, there's no inflation. So Trump knew that the entire economy was bubble, and it's every sector. Right before he was just the tech market, right? The tech companies. Then it moved into the housing bubble, and then in even a couple of years after, it moved into the auto market. And then it moved into the retail big box store market. But again, now we're seeing this bubble, this bubble that the Fed has now managed to reinflate. We are seeing it everywhere. I mean, any sector of the economy right now is bloated, is inflated. And obviously its productivity doesn't match the the prescribed value supposedly in dollar terms that it has. So, looking at that segment, it has showed me that Donald Trump understood the problems, and he made specific mention to the stock market. He said and this is a quote, "The only thing that looks good is the stock market, but even if the Fed raises interest rates just a little bit, the whole thing will come crashing down." And again, right there, it was like, this makes sense. This makes total sense because obviously the Fed has managed to just inflate the stock market. And obviously that correlates with inflating other bubbles. But the main bubble is the stock market. And then that leads to different other bubbles getting inflated because people can take some of their earnings from the market. Although most people don't. Most people just leave them there and reinvest them, and keep the bubble going. But some people who decide to cash out then spend that inflated um, their inflated gains on actual goods and services that then obviously drive the price up for other goods and services. Um, so Donald Trump understood that the Fed has managed to inflate this bubble, right? Under a vibrant economy, raising interest rates, telling people to start saving isn't a bad thing for the economy. In fact, it should be beneficial. But under a bloated economy, under an inflated bubble economy, which is all um, it's all built up by debt, raising interest rates is the worst thing for the economy because now you have to pay even more interest on the debt. And obviously people are going to be accustomed to debt. It's just like a drug, right? It's just like alcohol, it's just like a drug. Once you're used to it, it's very hard to take it away. And once somebody makes it more painful for you, and wants to push you towards getting away, then you feel like you need it, even more, um, even more than before. So it's like if I'm taking, again, this is a very crude example, but if I'm taking like a couple of pills, let's say 2 pills every day, and then suddenly I'm trying to stop, right? Then I'll start feeling some withdrawal effects, and then it'll feel like as if I need 3 or 4 pills to feel normal again, right? The 2 pills weren't enough now. I need even more pills because I'm starting to feel some of the withdrawal effects. So that segment right there proved it to me. And again, for me, I don't care about any of the other social stuff that Donald Trump talks about, right? All the abortion debate, the border debate. I don't care about any of that. All that comes secondary. To me, everything stems from the economy. If the economy is good, everything will follow. We'll find a way to resolve everything else. Because once the economy is good, once people feel like they are financially stable, financially secure, um, and they don't have to worry about their finances, then they could start diverting their attention towards resolving some of the other issues. And, me being a believer in God, I think that once people actually work hard for their money and earn their money in an honest way, then they'll make more moral and smart decisions with their money rather than going, doing sinful stuff with their extra cash that they otherwise wouldn't have worked for, or that currently they didn't work for. But if they had, they would have spent it on more, again, as I said, more moral things. But that's besides the point. Again, I don't like getting into that because some people don't believe in God, and pushing the message in God first before leading them to the effects, I think is a less effective and worse way of getting them to God, right? Instead of telling someone you need to believe in God and these are the effects, first tell them the effects and then they'll come to the conclusion that it leads them to God. But as I said, all the cultural stuff, all the societal things outside of the economy, that I put on pause because as long as we have a vibrant economy, an economy built on savings, built on work, the economy that we had in at the turn of the 20th century, people will believe in God. And obviously we see that in through the course of our own history, where the United States has been um, one of the most religious and most developed nations in the world. But and again, Donald Trump sort of brought back this message that he was going to bring back America to this old time. But unfortunately, he's failed. And I'll explain a couple things on what went wrong. I won't go into details, obviously. I won't go into specifics, but I'll sort of speak um, in terms of just the idea and what his messages were. And this is obviously stuff that he said and stuff that he's passed, and especially the executive orders, which is a big eye opener. So we'll get into it right now. So the first thing is interest rates. Again, Donald Trump has been touting for many years about how interest rates were kept too low for too long. And even in that segment that I mentioned before, he's actually mentioned the idea that the Fed has kept interest rates for too long. So it seemed as if Donald Trump knew that interest rates being this low encouraged a lot of debt. It warped the economy. It promoted a lot of malinvestments. It helped increase the inflation. It helped Wall Street grow richer, obviously on paper, because their gains now are inflated. And Main Street, right, normal everyday people suffer. They have an increase in their cost of living. And obviously, as I mentioned in the previous podcast, inflation encourages wealth inequality. The wealth gap between the poor and the rich and the middle class gets wiped out. So in that instance, Trump was right. Right? He understood the problems. He understood that low interest rates were bad, and so we needed to raise interest rates to correct the problems of the past. However, something obviously that he didn't mention in the campaign is the withdrawal that we're going to have to go through and the pain that we're going to have to go through into correcting the problems. Right? Let's bring it back to the example of an alcoholic, someone who's addicted to drugs or alcohol. If they're used to drinking that alcohol, if they're used to consuming those drugs and now they've become a drug addict or an alcoholic, and then they find out it's causing them all these problems despite obviously giving them that short-term benefit that it feels good at the moment, but obviously their families are falling apart. They can't get a job, and they're not obviously doing other things that they wish they would have been doing. And so they finally realize, this is a problem and let me correct myself. Well, if I just stop, obviously my has become accustomed to that. And it's going to be extremely painful for me to go a couple days, a weeks, or even months at first without consuming it. However, after that period, once my body finally realizes, all right, I'm not, it's not, I'm not taking in any of those of those substances anymore, then my body can start to recover. So you have that period of withdrawal, that period of rehabilitation. I mean, is what you could call it. That period is not something that's pleasurable for anybody. It's obviously painful. You can't go from doing something wrong to doing something good in a blink of an eye. You have to first go through this period where you've grown accustomed to doing those bad things. And now that you're stopping yourself from doing them, you have to suffer a little bit, sort of as a punishment for the bad things that you've done in the past before you can then continue on and try to recover. But that's something that Donald Trump hasn't told the voter. And this plays into what Trump has done in the presidency, where he's completely done an about face with his rhetoric. All of a sudden now, once the stock market started to go up, it had this artificial, this artificial hive, this artificial boom, and it was mainly from the optimism that Trump has ensued in the public, right? A lot of businesses, a lot of entrepreneurs, even the stock market got happy that they have this guy who's going to you know get rid of all these regulations, lower taxes, which obviously are just a microcosm of the major structural problems in the economy. But once Trump saw this gain, he said, "Wait a second, I can't stop this. I can't just all of a sudden, rain down this party and stop it. I got to keep this thing going." And this is probably why I'll get elected again from seeing all these booms. But you could see how when Trump got elected, he hasn't done anything in terms of the economy. Again, he's gotten some rid of some regulations, but that's obsolete. I mean, it's just a couple of regulations. Yes, he's reduced taxes, but not nearly. I mean, uh, as much as anybody would have hoped for. But again, all these are just minor things that Trump has done, which hasn't really changed the structure of the economy, and obviously hasn't changed government spending, and obviously has increased it since we've lowered our revenue. Uh, but Trump hasn't done anything, and yet the stock market started to go up, and then all of a sudden Trump says everything's going good. Right there, obviously, I knew this is just, it's just another politician. Trump is doing exactly what any other politician would do, in which they promise something, and then people get accustomed to that promise, but then they don't realize the pain that the country will go through in order to fulfill those promises. So they just pretend as if those promises has have been fulfilled. Right? It's like me telling a kid who's not doing their work, you need to do your work, and then I'll give you, and then we'll in the future I'll give you a nice batch of warm home baked cookies. So at first he gets happy. He's like, yes, he's thinking about the future. He's like, yes, I'm about to get cookies. But then what if you just see this child get happy and you're like, wow, I succeeded. I got him happy. You see that before he wasn't working. Now he got happy. He's thinking about doing his work. But obviously he still hasn't started doing his work. I've just got him happy by this promise because I've promised him something. But obviously the promise alone isn't going to do anything. It's just a rumor, right? It's like people who sell the rumor before the fact. Trump has told people that he's going to make things better. That got people happy, right? The market sort of got this optimistic gain. People, companies started to hire more people. Businesses started to take on debt. People started to take on debt because they thought that, hey, if the economy's going good, I'll for sure be able to pay back this debt. But he's just left it at that. Trump was scared to tell people, if you do want to recover, if we do want to go back to a sound economy, we're going to have to suffer short term, right? It's not an easy thing to get away with. We can't get away with all the damage that we've done to the economy in the past. He could have, but obviously Trump didn't level the public like this. He saw this gain. He saw this huge optimism that was in the market, obviously in 2015, 2016, and I think we even hit a high before he's even got elected. And he's just left it at that. He was scared, just as a politician would be, to level with the public and tell them that we're going to have to go through this short-term pain for 1 or 2 or 3 years to correct the problems of the past in order to, in the future, have a more successful and more vibrant economy and have a real recovery. So right there, Trump for me, I considered him just as a normal politician who promised things. People get happy from that promise, but he never fulfills the promise because he's afraid of the short-term pain that will go to that one will have to go through when fulfilling that promise. So, and we see this obviously, and another thing also, Trump has criticized the Fed and especially Janet Yellen at the time for being too political. She said that she was mainly doing these policies to make Trump look good, right? To inflate the economy, although it's going to cause long term damage. Short term, it's good because it makes the economy look good. We're going to pump all this money into the economy. It's going to inflate assets. People are going to feel like they're richer. And so they'll think that Obama has done a good job and that the economy is actually doing good. But obviously, that's extremely political because the Fed now is working in coalition with the presidency, with the government, and making the government seem as if it's doing something good. And Trump criticized again, rightfully so. Right, this is all things that are good. He's mentioning these problems that no other politician would ever mention. But again, he's done the same exact thing after appointing Jerome Powell. He's doing the same thing. He's constantly going on Twitter telling Jerome Powell to lower interest rates, to take on a lot of debt, let the government take on a lot of debt, and it's this. He's probably the most, or in this case, Jerome Powell is the most politically influenced Fed chairman ever, more so than Ben Bernanke or Alan Greenspan. And isn't that ironic that Trump, who's the first ever politician to criticize the Fed for being the most political, has now himself colluded the most politically with the Fed? And again, this is another telltale sign that Trump, it's very easy to go against politicians, but once you sit in their shoes, it's very hard to go against them. It's very hard to actually fulfill the stuff that you've promised. And you see this with every politician, right? It's so easy in the campaign to point fingers, to say you're going to do all these things, but once you get into that seat of power, you get accustomed, you get used to, and you don't want to actually fulfill the stuff because people can get happy and feel like stuff has changed just by the promise alone, and B, you don't want to level with the public and actually fulfill those promises, knowing that they might cause um, pain in the short term. But you then obviously do uh, commit to doing the same thing that all politicians do, is that they sacrifice short term, they sacrifice long term pain for short term gain because obviously they're in office for a couple of years or they just want to keep getting elected. And the only way for them to get elected is to show something good that they've done in the past. And so they're sacrificing the future because obviously they might not think that they're going to be in office many, many years from now. But obviously they're in office now, so why not make the economy look good now at the expense of the future? So again, the interest rates and the political Fed are both two hypocrisies in the economy that I've seen from Trump. And it's sad because what we're gonna see is that once we have this crash, once we have this economic collapse, it's gonna be a very dangerous place in America because you're gonna have Trump supporters who felt as if they had this person who's gonna do things that no other person could have even dreamt of doing, and completely revamp and change the political system, the economic system, and bring back America, and then it just falls flat on its face. The whole plan just collapses right before their eyes. And so, what is that going to do to their enthusiasm? What is that going to do to their beliefs. They might just end up giving up on the whole idea of limited government, on constitutional values. They might see that Trump embodied that, and now that it's fell uh, flat on its face, maybe they were wrong. And they're going to start thinking that maybe these Democrats are right. Maybe these socialists are right. These Republicans are what caused these collapse. And you could see it through history, right? You have Republicans. Well, first you have Democrats who inflate this massive bubble, and then Republicans who come in attempting to correct the bubble, but they just get into, they get into the moment and they just continue to inflate it and it collapses on their in their term. And so everybody's accustomed to saying, hey, the Republicans have caused this crash indirectly. Yes, they've caused it because they've inflated and they've continued the problems, but they don't realize that the problem started with the last presidency, the one who was in office before, and that would be the Democrats. So you have, Clinton, who's inflated the bubble in the 90s, and then Bush getting elected to, to sort of correct the problems that Clinton has done. But obviously, again, as I said, he gets into that political seat. He just does whatever the previous person does, continues to continues to inflate it, and then it ends up crashing in his term. Everybody now links Bush to the '08 financial crisis. Then we elect someone even farther left, even farther more socialist, even farther more Democrat, um, and that would be Obama. And then he now inflates the economy. People think, oh, Obama's good. He's gotten us from, from these lows to now these highs. And then people correlate those two together. Trump now, just like Bush, gets elected, claiming to correct these artificial inflationary gains of the previous presidency. But again, he gets in the moment. He gets that political. I don't even know what to call it. It's like this political. Um, now they call it the Trump Kool-Aid. I would just call it like the government drug or whatever, the political drug, and you just continue the policies of the previous presidency, and then when it crashes on your part, yes, you've sort of contributed to the crash, but it's the previous presidency that has initiated it. So it's the same cycle and over again. And if after Bush we've gotten Obama, and if you compare Obama and Clinton, Obama's far um, more extreme on the left side of the political spectrum than Clinton was. Um, just imagine, and obviously again, Trump being more right than Bush. Just imagine how left, how socialist this next president will be. When this crash happens, if it happens before Trump's reelection. Although I personally think that Trump won't get reelected, but that's the scary part, right? Imagine it's almost like you know it's almost like somebody who believed. I'm going to give two examples, but first, think about a kid who's believed in Santa his whole childhood, right up until, let's say, 8 years old or 7 years old. He's believed in Santa, and he's never seen anybody criticize Santa. He's never seen anybody doubt his existence. All he's been accustomed to is Santa, being this real thing that actually exists. He's never heard any opposition. Nobody's ever come up and laughed at him. He's never seen any um, commercial that depicted a fake Santa. He's only accustomed to seeing the real Santa, the real thing. And he thinks that it's this actual thing that exists. And then at one moment, for the first time ever, somebody comes up and tells him, "Yeah, that's actually not real." It's just it's the shock and it's the soul crushing thing that person has to face. And then from that moment, he probably won't believe in anything ever again because he'll be like, "All right, I believed in that and that wasn't real. I'm not going to believe in anything now." Um, Apply this to God, right? Imagine someone, for their entire life not being accustomed to any criticism of God, and then all of a sudden somebody just comes up to him and tells him, "Yeah, God's not real," or they see something, they have this revelation that God's not real. It's soul crushing. Same thing goes for all these Republicans who sort of understood the problems. They've subscribed to Trump and his initial campaign messages because they were, in fact, truthful, and then they they get misled. They don't see that Trump hasn't fulfilled those promises, hasn't stick to his initial plans and his initial goals, or these now he's warped the goals a little bit. After that, everything comes crashing down, and then they have this revelation. I mean, and this is why we'll see this huge um, switch to the left, just as how we saw it under Obama, where you had all these people who voted for Bush, realized that Bush wasn't didn't keep up with his promises, and then decided to switch and give this Democrat a chance. But now we're seeing an even more scale. I mean, you haven't seen that optimism with Bush, obviously, as we've seen with Trump. So just imagine how left this country will turn after this economic collapse, how everybody is now going to tie Trump to this economic collapse. It's honestly scary. It's very scary. Obviously, I haven't lived through the I mean, I've sort of lived through it, but I was too young. The election of Obama back in '08, and how I would have assumed that a lot of Republicans, or not a lot of Republicans, excuse me, a lot of free market libertarians, how they would have saw this huge swing to the left, how dangerous that would have been for them, or how scary it would have been for them. But I'm definitely feeling it now, how we have this Republican who, once you take the Republican title, you sort of claim the title of capitalism. You claim this title of limited government, constitutionalism, uh, lower taxes, lower regulation, more free, more of a free economy. So you claim this title. You don't ever follow the actual policies. You don't actually subscribe to any of the individual um, ideals, and then the whole economy crashes. And with that are those ideals, are those names, are those things that you've tied yourself to. It's just extremely scary to think that people who've supported Trump now, when they see this crash, what are they going to do? They're probably never going to subscribe to a Republican ever again, because they'll just think that they're a bunch of liars, a bunch of people who made false promises. So it's truly scary. This is why Trump has failed us. I think people need to admit that Trump has not fulfilled this promise, and they shouldn't be afraid to admit that, because we ultimately need to stay true to our values. You need to stay true to the values of limited government, free market, um, capitalism. I mean, you could just call it capitalism, free market, limited government, capitalism. Stick to those ideas, and don't let somebody who comes and uses those names to gain supporters, but actually doesn't fulfill in um, facilitating those policies, come and deviate you away from those ideals. Because what the real failures, what the real punishment is, are going to be all those people who thought that that person was actually a, a messenger for those ideas, and how those ideas failed, and then they'll just think that those ideas are what failed, not the actual person. I know I sort of said that in a very misconstrued way, but what I mean is, don't let people think that capitalism failed, or the free market failed, or these ideas failed, because you need to elevate yourself from that thinking and say, you know what, it's the person that failed. It's the same thing with God, right? A lot of people who say, I don't believe in God because the belief in God is what has led people to die in the past, and all these religious wars and these crusades. But it's the same thing happening now. People are tying the beliefs, the ideals, to the failure. But in fact, the failure is from the person, from the individual who, apart from those ideals, who probably failed to fulfill those ideals. That's where the punishment lies. That's where the failure lies, is from the person. We haven't fully embraced capitalism, or I don't think we've embraced it at all, not even to a smaller extent. Trump has not embraced the Constitution, limited government, free market capitalism that he said he was going to embrace. And so when this thing crashes, it's because he's failed to embrace those things, not because he has attempted to, which doesn't make any sense, right? Even if I attempt something and I fail, it's my fault that I failed, not the policies that I'm trying to, attempt to follow. But that's the dangerous thing. You are going to see all these Trump supporters now, look at their shoulders and see and say, is this what I've, have I been led to something false? And they'll maybe switch to socialism, and we're seeing a rise in socialism. And I mean, just from the crowds, I mean, the people who are now subscribing to socialism are just a lot of conservative people who now switch to becoming liberal. It's not like it's all just blue haired people, red haired people, nose piercings, covered in face tats, right? You would think that that's going to be all of the socialists, all of the Bernie supporters. But, you look at the crowd and it just looks like regular people, it's just like you could mistake them for a conservative. So that's the problem. You're going to see people now that think that Trump has actually fulfilled those promises. And when they see this entire thing come crashing down, they're going to think that those promises are what caused the thing rather than the person. So Trump has failed us. We need to actually admit to it, and we need to then attempt to correct it and level with people and tell them the truth instead of telling them a lie because we're afraid of the effects of them knowing the truth. So I wanted to end it right there. It was a very nice conclusion, I think. And I like ending in quotes that I've derived. But I just have to mention another thing. Although I did say I was going to talk about a lot of the stuff that he's did, and I've only talked about the the Fed and the economy slash interest rates. But I also wanted to make note of this whole healthcare debate that has happened. First of all, when Trump says he's going to repeal and replace Obamacare, it sort of sounded good, but 50% because the repeal part sounds great. He's going to get rid of this government program. I mean, when has that ever happened in a presidency where a government or a president or anybody actually gotten rid of a program completely? That sounded good, right? I was like, yes, he's going to get rid of this program. We can finally slowly and hopefully he'll get back, remove some more stuff, and remove and lift some more restrictions on the healthcare system and make it more efficient, more productive. But he hasn't. I mean, he now wants to replace it with his own version of this Obamacare, which still keeps um, the the issue with people with pre-existing conditions, right? How they could still get insured even though they have a pre-existing condition, which I want to make another podcast, another episode specifically on the irony in healthcare. But Trump has made that promise to keep that provision in place, which doesn't make any sense because that's basically the whole crux of Obamacare is that you can get insured even though you have a pre-existing condition, meaning you're just essentially getting free healthcare from the government in the guise of this insurance thing that the government is sponsoring. So it's almost like instead of the government giving you a free house, it gives you free money to go buy a house. It's the same thing, right? It's not like one is wrong and one is right. It's still the government giving you something for nothing, right? Take that to the healthcare. Instead of the government just giving out healthcare to people, it's giving people insurance to then go and get the healthcare. Which again doesn't make any sense. I'll make an entire episode specifically on that point. But this is another thing Trump has run on. He's run on the failures of Obamacare, but it's more um, it's becoming more of the case that The only reason why Trump doesn't like Obamacare is that Obama made it, and that he'll make his own Trump care that looks better and sounds better, and that he wants his name attached to something like that. He could claim that, yeah, he did that. Right? It's not like he's against Obamacare because he's a free market guy. He's a capitalist. He wants to bring the free market to the healthcare system. He wants to get rid of this inefficient, bloated government program that'll just drag us um, that'll drag down the healthcare system, and he's trying to just uh, socialize it. It's not like he was against those things and for this free market healthcare system. He just didn't like Obamacare because Obama did it, and he thinks that he wants to do it uh, more better. It's like two socialists debating over the what system of how should this wealth be distributed, or what in what way should this wealth be distributed. It's the same thing. And so to conclude, basically, Trump is essentially just another big government guy. He was a Democrat before, right? I mean, that's not a surprise to anyone. He was a Democrat before. Trump is just another big government guy who thinks that he could run government more efficiently. And that's now becoming the whole gist of his narrative, right? He thinks that the government is stupid and that the government could still fix problems. It's just that you need to have smart government, right? He'll be that guy who makes government smart, which doesn't make any sense because if you understand how economics and government and politics work, the reason why people who subscribe to the free market and believe in capitalism do not like a government system, um, healthcare, or let alone any government run program or system, is because we understand that having this centrally planned system where few people plan the actions of many or of the masses does not work, and it's always going to be inefficient because if you're going to let a group of people decide how everything should be and the interactions, it's obviously going to be less efficient than just letting the people who you're trying to control themselves. And so Trump doesn't understand that, or at least I think he doesn't portray himself as not as understanding that. He just thinks that government doesn't work and that Republicans want to use that big government in another way, right? It's just I've made a podcast on this before where I say that capitalism is just a lack of a system. It's not like capitalism and socialism are just are two systems that are trying to that are fighting each other, and whatever one we choose is a system that we can implement. It's the real debate between capitalism and socialism is should we have a system in place to control the economy? You have capitalism, which is a systemless form, and you have socialism, which is a system. So Trump just thinks that Democrats want to rule government one way and Republicans want to rule government this way. That's not the case uh, in the past. In the past, it's Democrats had a more socialist, more government focused plan where the government attempts to fix problems and to implement systems in place and bureaucrats in place to solve problems and to centrally plan things. Whereas Republicans wanted to restrict that ability, had a more limited government idea, where people, the market controls their interactions, their own interactions. There's no other person sitting behind them telling them what decision to make. They make their own decisions. So Trump does not understand that distinction. He thinks that because the Democrats have failed in their attempts at creating this vibrant economy, he can do so better just in a different way, but still facilitating those decisions through the government. Um, that's scary because now he's, again, as I mentioned before, he's now attached himself. He's branded himself as this free market guy, but he has done nothing that reflects anything of the free market. So to conclude, I basically only focused on healthcare, or let me just conclude the healthcare real quick. Trump is the only way for us to have the only way for us to have a more efficient, more effective, more productive, less expensive, higher quality healthcare system is to let it be run by the free market. Let people make their own decisions. Let companies make their own decisions that ultimately puts uh, competition. I mean, that's the simplest way of putting it. That puts competition between healthcare companies, and we can get into the idea of insurance in another podcast. But let insurance companies compete for your business. That's the most effective way for you to get the best option. But instead, government now has colluded with healthcare and vice versa. Healthcare has colluded itself with government. And when that happens, you get screwed over. You're the one who now has less option, less choice, has less influence over the price, right? It's not like if you decide not to go there, they're gonna try to then grab your service, because then they'll just grab their business somewhere else. So that's the most efficient way. And when you let government collude with healthcare, it's just a recipe for government taking over healthcare, right? Step one, government colludes with healthcare and destroys it from within. And then government then claims it's the solution and then says the solution is to take over the entire healthcare system. That's the way, I mean, that's what's being played out right now. And obviously, you have socialists now who want to go complete out, full single payer system, as we see all over the rest of the world, which is really unfortunate. I mean, why would you want to have the same exact healthcare system in the entire world? I mean, the United States is unique in that we have this I mean, again, I'm not happy with the system we have now, obviously, but the United States is unique in that we have this last emblem of free market healthcare, just a sliver of it. And you would seriously want to wipe that away and just make every single healthcare system in the world the same? I mean, don't you want a little bit of diversity, right? We're not just one big country, we're a bunch of diverse countries, each having different ideas on how we should run things. So there's people who bring the argument that the healthcare system that we have now is bad, primarily on the case that it's different than everybody else's. It's like saying, you walk into a room, everybody's smoking, and there's one person not smoking, and going up to him and saying, you know what, you're not smoking, that's a bad thing. Why? Because everybody else is smoking. So that's not a case. Again, I don't agree with the healthcare system it is now, because it's the most bloated system there is because of its intervention with government. But saying that the system right now is not good simply because it's different from everybody else's is not an argument. So those two are the most important for me. You have the healthcare debate thingy, and then you have the economic thingy. So you have the healthcare case, and then you have the economic case. But for me, the economic case is the supreme be all and end all, because if that succeeds, then everything else follows through. If that fails, everything else fails. So that is it for this episode. I really want to start debating I really want to start debating socialists, people who'd rather vote for, people like Bernie and just overall Democrats, or even people who'd vote for Republicans and big government Republicans. And even, I think, I'm not sure what the word is for the Republicans in the past who sort of wanted to also have a big government, who also subscribe to this idea of big government. But I think they're called Rhino Republicans. I remember it stood for something. Rhino Republicans in name only. Yeah, I think that's what it is. Rhino Republicans, Republican in name only. So there was obviously rhinos in the past that um said they're Republican, but they believed in big government programs and big government policies, essentially planned policies. So we need to tell people that essentially the goal is to try to convince people, especially Trump supporters, that Trump is a Rhino. He's just Republican in name only. He's even said he was a Democrat in the past. If Obama had been Republican, he would have then been a Democrat because he's just opposed to Obama. It's like Trump being opposed to Obama. So it's like the enemy of your enemy is your friend, right? That idea where I don't like Obama, you don't like Obama either, so I'm just going to side with you. So the enemy of your enemy is your friend. That's where Trump falls in, where he just saw the Republican Party as being opposed to somebody he didn't like, which was Obama, so he subscribed to him. If Obama had been Republican, he would have became a Democrat. So there's nothing special about Trump and his policies. I mean, he says he believes in God, but I mean, after the things that he said, I highly doubt that. But let me just conclude this episode. I know this is probably my longest episode yet, and I put a lot of stuff in here, but I think it's all important stuff that everybody needs to be aware of, and especially from a Trump supporter. I mean, I was a Trump supporter. I was the odd person out of my high school who supported Trump, and I'm putting this stuff out there so I can tell people I don't agree with him now. I don't like him anymore. I agree with campaign Trump, and campaign Trump is totally different from campaign Trump is totally different from President Trump. Now, it's hard to tell that that this person, well, in this case, Trump's not a politician, but it's hard to tell that somebody's lying because you could believe, like, if I come out and I say things that are good and I subscribe to them, and then later he ends up doing an about face and going 180, there's no way for me to know that, right? In hindsight, I do, but before, there's no way for me to know that. So there's no way for me to know that Trump wasn't going to actually fulfill the stuff that he said that he was going to fulfill. He did say good things in the campaign that I do agree with, and I do agree with campaign Trump. But President Trump is someone I don't agree with, and there's no way for me knowing that President Trump was going to be different than campaign Trump, because, and I think one justification for that is he wasn't a politician. So I could say, hey, he's not a politician who's just going to rely on his promises. But now that I know, and the instant I know that he's not going to fulfill his promises, I will come out against him. And so that's why I put all this stuff out here so I could, lay claim that I'm not for Trump anymore, and that at one point I was for him, and now I'm not. And hopefully this video helps convince people not to just blindly subscribe to him. And hopefully, I mean, if he wins, it's going to be unfortunate because the crash it's almost inevitable. It has to happen next term, if not by November. It is going to for sure happen in his second term. But if we get Biden elected, then it could happen in his term. I mean, it may even happen right after he gets elected, before even the inauguration. And the crash might happen if Biden gets elected. But the scary thing is, even if Biden gets elected and the crash happens, people will still think that Trump was this person who believed in Republican values and in true Republican values and in limited government, free market ideals. So no matter where you dice it, you still need to just, Trump himself needs to come out and say, I am not a true Republican. I am not someone who likes, who follows the Constitution to its fullest, and someone who believes in limited government and the free market. Because if the crash happens under Trump, people still think that he's followed those ideals. And if Biden gets elected and the crash happens under him, people will still think that Trump has done a good job. I mean, yes, you could say that, yeah, we need the free market and all that, but they might still think that Trump wasn't, or they might still falsely think that Trump was a person who subscribed to those ideals. But anyway you dice it, it's still bad. We still, obviously the best case scenario is for Trump to just come out and admit. But if more people start to realize and admit, I think we could definitely level with people in the entire political sphere, or the spectrum, excuse me, and give free market capitalism a chance, something that it hasn't got in many, many years. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay safe.